and this meeting's being recorded. And we will add it to our library of Spotify, YouTube, and every other way of accessing previous in conversations, whether you want to listen to Paul Smith in the gym, going out for a run, making your tea. It'll all be available probably in a week or so on various platforms. Before we start, I just want to make just to remind everyone about the In Conversation we're doing in a fortnight, which is absolutely brilliant timing for the election campaign. And I think Andy Bates is going to be talking to the one and only a bloke for whom the word inestimable was created, John Perry, an absolute housing legend, is going to be talking to us on the 6th of June. And he's going to be talking about something that we're really handy on the doorstep, and whereas his title is what do migrants mean for housing, and what housing rights do migrants have? So actually begin to deal with some of the nonsense that we hear on a regular basis about the relationship between immigration and housing. John's recently contributed to another CIH piece of work on temporary accommodation, people with no recourse to public funds. So I think that'll be an absolutely fantastic event, and that's the 6th of June. And Josh has put the registration in the link. So for that, I feel like I've got loads of people I know on here, so I'm getting overexcited, which is my want. For those who don't know, my name is Alison Inman. I'm Vice Chair of Labour Housing Group, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening, who is Paul Smith, who's wearing a very nice shirt with houses on. He tells me it is Rotterdam, is that right?
It is, yeah.
And Paul is what I would call a housing polymath. He's done most of the jobs, I think, within the housing sector, and has a unique perspective. He's been a Labour councillor for many. He was a Labour councillor for many years. He's cabinet member for housing in Bristol. He's currently a chief executive of a small traditional housing association. He's worked in housing associations, chief executive of Place Shapers for a while, and also has a degree in astrophysics. I don't know, he's the only housing chief exec I know who's done that. And excuse me, leaning in like that. He's also written a book that you can't actually see, which is brilliant, called Heartcliffe Betrayed, The Fading of a Post-War Dream, published by Bristol Radical Pamphleteers, and it's a really, really good read about housing estates and what happened to it. A really personal as well as fantastic historical and political read. So Paul, we talked about title for this, and you came up with housing associations, friend or foe, which is really interesting. And I was really struck when I rejoined the Labour Housing Group exec and started talking to different people, the hostile relationship that exists between some parts of the left and housing associations. So we thought that would be a really good thing to get your views about, Paul. So do you want to sort of just kick off? And then I've got some questions for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as you know, I've been both sides of the fence in terms of local government, and you often get people saying, particularly Labour councillors, but also activists, that housing associations, social housing isn't proper social housing, The only proper social housing is council housing. And so I think part of the discussion around this was, I guess, to explore that, whether housing associations are proper social housing providers or not, or whether the only way of delivering genuine affordable housing is through local authorities. Obviously, I'm biased, and will have a particular view, which I guess people will probably guess because I am a housing association chief executive. But I grew up in council housing. I lived in council housing until my mid-30s. So even whilst I was working in the housing association sector, I was still a council tenant. I was in 1988, I was at the age of 3, first elected to Bristol City Council. And I fought really hard to get on the housing committee because I represented an area which was almost all council housing, apart from odd bits of private housing that had been built in the 70s, and the houses that have been sold through the right to buy, which, you know, we're still sort of seen as council housing. It's still seen as a council estate. So I thought it was really important to be on the housing committee because it felt to me like the housing department controlled everything where I lived. Not just the housing, but all the open spaces. They were responsible for all those wonderful signs that were put up on poles which said no ball games here, which were really great as football posts. And I stayed on the housing committee back then for 10 years. But even then, you know, we had that problem in the 80s as councils. It was pretty much impossible for us to build. The last council housing we built in the 80s in Bristol was sheltered housing, because there was a little bit of an exemption for a time when you could build sheltered housing. But when I looked at some of the real poor quality housing stock in my ward, which, you know, quite frankly needed to be demolished, the only show in town at that time was to replace it with housing association housing. But that created a dilemma, because housing association rents were higher than council rents, and you had the situation that the people who lived in those flats that you were demolishing couldn't actually afford to move into the housing that was replacing it. They had to move into other council housing on the estate because the rents were just too high for them. Because even back then in the 80s and 90s, housing association rents were higher on the whole than local authority rents. I think there was a general view certainly in my local authority at the time, but it's something I picked up. I was working for the National Housing Federation at the time, that it was also often felt that housing associations cherry picked the tenants that they took on. So they weren't taking the people off the top of the waiting list. They were being much more choosy about who they would let into their homes. Of course, at that time, housing associations were sort of fairly marginal until stock transfer came along, which started in the late 80s and into the 90s, and certainly didn't happen in Bristol, and still hasn't happened in Bristol. There was a stock transfer by the back door, that poor quality council housing was being demolished, and in its place was housing association homes being built. So the land was being transferred, if not the houses. So there was, back then, even then, there was that sort of dichotomy that housing associations were something other, and also potentially seen as a threat to council housing. And that issue of being a threat, I remember going to National Housing Federation conferences in the late 80s and early 90s with Jim Coulter standing up and talking about housing associations have moved centre stage, that they were now the new builders of social housing. And that was seen by councils again as a threat, that housing associations were now doing what they used to do, that they were sort of, you know, parking their tanks on the local authority lawns. So this sort of division between the two, I think, really dates back to, the Thatcher period, and hasn't entirely been resolved. How long do I have to keep waffling, Alison,
No, no,
before
I've
you
got lots of
interrupt me?
questions, but I don't want to interrupt you because I'm
Yeah.
enjoying listening to you.
Mm.
I'm just wondering about, so I've spent time on both sides of that fence, I imagine lots of people on the call have. So I work for a local authority. I chair the National Federation of Almost, so the trade body for organisations that needed to access decent homes funding, but didn't want to do stock transfer or couldn't get a ballot through or whatever. And also involved latterly in housing associations. Um, and it feels very different, and I'm not quite sure why. I think there's definitely something about accountability. And I think it feels as if an organization is has much greater accountability. It's local authority, and particularly, as an Almo chair, I felt accountable to absolutely everybody. Um, in a way that felt slightly different even to being within the local authorities, stuff retained. So, and I think it feels as if that matters more now. Um, we have much more, public discourse, whether it's on, Twitter, Facebook, wherever. People talk about their landlords, talk about the issues that they've got, and talk a lot about whether they feel they can influence their landlord, even contact their landlord sometimes. I wondered if you had any thoughts around accountability as a sort of starting
Well,
point.
one of the things about the local authority is that you could argue that there's a very clear accountability, but that accountability is to the whole of the wider community through the election of councillors. Certainly, when I was in Bristol, we had 14 area committees that were tenants committees that had some devolved spending powers, but also would meet centrally. So you get about 100 tenants usually in the main council building, which would discuss things like the repairs program. They would be consulted on the rent rise that we would have each year. And so the accountability wasn't just seen as being directly through the elected councillors, but also through the area housing committees and the tenants associations. In As you'll know, in the mid-90s, the National Housing Federation launched their first code of governance, which was called Competence and Accountability. And the reason it was called Competence and Accountability, because those were the two things that there was concern about. Firstly, the competence of housing associations to deal with the mixed funding regime, and also about them being, in terms of their roots, being very paternalistic. Which, some of that dates back to that sort of Victorian era of housing associations. And a lot of the associations that were created in the 70s, before the Housing Corporation came in as a regulator, they would have a surveyor and an architect and a range of professionals who, it wasn't unknown for them to give each other jobs through the housing association that they were on the board of. And then they'd say have the vicar or somebody who would be a representative of the wider community, or somebody from social services. And so it wasn't, again, by local authorities in the 80s and 90s, housing associations were seen as not being very accountable. There was a big shift in the 90s to get tenants on boards. And then in the noughties, there was a big shift to get tenants off boards. And then that's sort of come in full cycle again, in terms of the housing associations. I think it's interesting. I worked as what was called a tenant's friend, or an independent tenant advisor, during the 2000s, and yeah, I was quite shocked at some of the things I found in some local authorities, particularly some of the small rural local authorities, where basically, despite the housing revenue account supposedly being ring fenced, about a third, up to a third of the rent was going into propping up the council. And there are all sorts of ways in which, you know, the council would bill the HRA for all sorts of things, and actually delivering pretty terrible services to some of the tenants. And when those stock transfers happened in those small rural authorities, you found that a lot of them became almost completely unviable and disappeared. I mean, I think the first local, there's a lot of talk about local authorities going bust at the moment, but I think the first one that really went bust was West Somerset. And that was because once it had done its stock transfer, I mean, it was a planning authority and a licensing authority, but not a great deal else. And its going bust was hidden by it joining into Taunton Deane Council. But I think there are quite a lot of other of those small rural authorities that were milking the housing revenue account for everything that they possibly could. So you could argue, yes, there was a line of accountability that tenants could vote, although we know, of course, tenants are one of the least likely groups to vote. But local authorities were, you know, basically using that a lot of tenants' money for things which were nothing at all to do with services for tenants and services to the housing. So I don't think it's straightforward. I don't think it's straightforward. And of course, within the mix of that, of course, you've got housing cooperatives, which have got a longer history, which were very accountable. You had some of the estate-based transfers, which also had very, very high levels of engagement and accountability, even though they were in the housing association sector. So, I mean, the housing association sector is incredibly wide. You know, you've got, you know, almshouses dating back hundreds of years through to, and which are tiny, all the way through to, you know, now enormous organisations with over 100,000 homes. And the way things are going, we might just end up with, you know, a couple of dozen housing associations running pretty much 95% of all of the stock.
I mean, it feels like that. Don't let me go down that rabbit hole yet, but we'll sort of come back to it. So why do you think it is that, I mean, if you look back to 2019, I know that not 2019, 2017, there was a real battle to get into the manifesto a commitment to build 100, was it 150,000? I can't remember what we were doing back then. Social homes a year. And that was a real battle to get that to be social homes rather than council housing. And there is still this, particularly on the left, it sometimes feels like there is an absolute demonisation of the housing association sector and frankly a bit of a romanticising of the council sector. And I think to me it's always felt like there are some really good housing association landlords providing absolutely cracking services, and the same in the council sector. But you know, we only have to look at what the Ombudsman is finding to see that there's some absolutely shit council housing and some absolutely awful housing association housing. But we seem to have a blind spot particularly within the Labour Party, about actually being honest about that.
I think the other blind spot is, I mean, I remember, as I say, going back into the 80s, 90s, and it actually, for me, in 2019 became a big issue in Bristol, was the, you know, there's an election coming up, let's not put the rents up. And of course, that's very attractive. You don't want to put the rents up so that people can't afford them. And quite frankly, we've got a benefit system now where for lots of people, they can't afford any type of social housing, even social housing. And that's why there's a lot of people, or one of the reasons why there's a lot of people in temporary accommodation, because their rent's being paid for them outside of universal credit, because their universal credit won't cover their rent. Is that a lot of councils were not prepared to put the rents up to an extent to keep the properties up to a good standard. The solution to that, and much more under Blair than it was under Thatcher and Major was the stock transfer was the answer, was to refinance the stock by moving it out of the state sector and into, you know, the third sector, the third way that we used to hear a lot from Tony Blair back in the day. And most people who would consider themselves on the left would call that privatization. That a state-owned asset was being privatized and moved into the private sector under the guise of a sort of voluntary sector housing association model. And that the resentment of that and the concern about that still exists in the same way that people are not happy that water's in the private sector, or railways, or electric and gas and all those other things. It was so that shift of you know, over 2 million local authority homes into the housing association sector, alongside over 1 million that were sold through right to buy, is, you know, by some people, and I think it's, you know, it's an arguable case that was, you know, the biggest privatization of the country. So that there are a lot of people who feel that housing should still be run under the state, and to bring it back under local authority control. And I think that's where that sort of ideology, you know, I might be typifying this incorrectly, but I think that's where the ideological issue is. And it's the same as other public services being kept in the public sector rather than in a pseudo public sector. And you know, it's you know, I can understand that ideological difference that exists. I mean, I'm terrible on going on about history, Alison, so I'm sorry about that. You know, I was going to promote a book, you know, this fantastic
It's a wonderful book. If you've not read it, read it.
Yeah.
John, it is a fantastic book.
Which, you know, it talks about effectively the privatization of council housing. Is, you know, it's still a real issue, and I guess there is a debate about what should be in the state and what should be outside. I mean, the attitude I took when I was cabinet member for housing for Bristol was that I wanted a big increase in the amount of social housing delivered. We all know that the word affordable has been devalued to, you know, basically because of the fix when the housing capital grant was cut by the coalition, and they came up with the affordable rent, and then had to talk about affordable rather than social. But if you go back, say to 1979, I don't know, is an interesting year. In 1979, there were 5 million council houses in the country and 250,000 housing associations. And the housing associations were doing that, were seen on the whole as doing that classic sort of charitable sector thing. They were doing complementary. They were doing what the state didn't do. So sheltered housing was pioneered within housing associations. A lot of homelessness provision and supported provision and specialist provision was located within housing associations. So they were seen to complement what the state did. And then in the 80s and 90s, they basically took over what the state was doing. And that resentment remains among some people.
So if we fast forward to now, I mean, I find increasingly the older I get, the longer I like to spend in the past. I'm far more comfortable in the past, I think, than possibly in the here and now.
But I mean, the past's important because it helps you understand how you've got to where you are now.
Yeah, but where we are now, we have a bigger housing association sector. We have some real lack of understanding. We've been competing, the two sectors. I mean, you know, when I was in the Elmo sector, it was pretty much, you know, we've got to work really, really hard. Housing associations can chuck money at everything and, you know, everything will be fine. And, you know, some myths around housing associations. Moving into housing associations, I was, there is this real thing about we're special, we're better. It feels like we had needed to distinguish ourselves from council housing, which I never quite understood. And some of the um, some of the things that we get thrown at us, I suppose within the Labour Party is what we start with one. Chief executive of an association gets paid 350, 400 grand a year. Is that right? The leader of Birmingham, leader of a Birmingham City Council, I don't know what he gets paid, but it's nowhere near. It's, the chief executive, isn't there a cap on chief exec salaries within the local authority sector? But salaries are a real issue both for tenants and for being an easy target for the right. Has it gone mad? Is it just ridiculous? Who needs 400 grand a year?
Yeah, well, I don't know what I'd do without all that money, Alison. But I mean, but there is a really, if you compare a director of housing role, so in the southwest, the director of housing for Bristol was advertised recently for Bristol City Council, 27,000 homes. The salary there was up to about 130. There are associations in the southwest with between 5 and 10,000 homes that are paying 150. So the housing association sector for senior staff do pay more than local authorities without a doubt. And so it is an issue. I remember when I was at cabinet one time talking about a scheme that we were doing with a housing association, a large national association, and of course I got heckled from the gallery that the chief exec of that association earned £350,000 that previous year. Not there's it was true. You can read it in the accounts how much we all earn, and it is at a higher level than is paid in the local authority sector. Some people would argue, I guess, that if you're a chief executive, you've got far more responsibility than you've got as a director of housing. People can make their own minds up about that, but I
Twice as
think
much as the Prime Minister.
I think there's a lot been said actually. The Prime Minister with about 150, 160,000, but they've got free accommodation in London and free accommodation out in the countryside and all sorts of other perks. I know poor Boris Johnson, he had to pay for his own burgers or something. I can't remember what the story was, but there's an issue there. I don't think it's the biggest one. It gets as I say, it does get raised sometimes, but there's a big difference, of course, if you're in a local authority which has got council housing and housing association provision, and one that's only got housing association provision. And we have to remember that most local authorities have not got housing revenue account, have not got housing, and therefore for them, housing associations are the only show in town, and they have to work with the sector. In Bristol, where I was cabinet member, the council had 27,000 homes, housing associations had 12,000. So the council provision is more than twice the associations in Bristol, but a lot of the housing association properties in Bristol have been built since 1974, and so a lot of them tend to be more modern, except for a lot of the stuff that was repossessed in the 80s, and so they've got a lot of Victorian stock as well. But the councils, Bristol Council's got 59 tower blocks to deal with, high rise. So obviously after Grenfell, there was a huge issue in Bristol, which was much more a local authority issue than a housing association issue. But one of the things I did was I looked at the council's land in terms of meeting provision was, you know, how can I get the most additional social housing in Bristol that I possibly can? And so the first thing we did is took all of our housing land off the market. The previous mayor, who was an independent, was about to sell 80 hectares of housing land across the city. So just removed all of that from the market and then said, okay, well, let's look at all this land in the reasonable near future. How much of it can be built by the local authority through the HRA? And so not a great deal, because at that time the borrowing cap was still on. It was more when the borrowing cap was removed. Then we set up a housing company so that we could build through the general fund. And the way we set up the company in Bristol was that all of the affordable housing, because it would build a mixture of for sale and social rent and a little bit of shared ownership, that would all of that affordable provision would be sold to the HRA. Then if we had sites that couldn't be developed out by the council, either through the HRA or through the housing company, then that land would be offered to housing associations and community-led housing organisations, which are like the new kids on the block in terms of the housing association sector. You could say as lots of housing associations get bigger, you're always going to get some small new entrants in, and it's the community housing sector that's mainly doing that. And then only if it couldn't be built out by any of those would we look at potentially selling privately. And when I was doing that, I only sold one piece of land privately, and that was a small farmhouse that nobody wanted, not even the community organisations wanted. And in Bristol, with a lot of councils, if we were going to make major progress, which we did with building social housing, we had to use all of those levers. We had to use housing associations, we had to use council, we had to use community-led, and we had to find ways of working out which sites or projects were best delivered by each of those, rather than saying it should all be council or it should all be housing association. It seemed to me that the more players I had building social housing, the more social housing I was going to get, and the more investment I was going to be able to attract in. So for me, it always felt that it needed to be a partnership between the two sectors. And part of that partnership, obviously, is the binding of housing associations into local authority letting policies.
And I think that goes nicely into my next point, which was around allocations. And I think Andy Bates has joined the call, just back from an afternoon in the theatre, I believe. Very cultured man. And one of the things Andy talks about often is allocations. And again, I wonder if that's a bit of a myth around, because our nomination agreements are agreed with your local authority anyway, to a massive extent, and yet there is still what I think is a bit of a myth that housing associations are cherry picking tenants. Won't
I think it was true in the 80s. I don't think it's true now. I don't think it's true now. And if anything, local authorities and housing associations sometimes in some areas might say, let's have a sensitive lettings policy, but that's jointly agreed between the two. But the housing crisis is of such a terrible nature that only people in the top bands actually get housing, in the top two bands, unless you're over 55 and can access sheltered housing where there's a bit less of pressure, then both local authorities and housing associations are basically taking most of the families that they're taking are either coming out of supported housing or they're coming out of TA. And practically the waiting list is almost a complete myth, certainly in most of the south of England. And I think the biggest problem, one of the biggest farces in terms of lettings is choice-based lettings, because there is no choice, because there's such a mismatch between supply and demand that trying to treat it as an eBay type system is actually, I actually find it quite sickening. I know so many people, you know, in Bristol, it was Tuesday, it still is, in fact, Tuesday night at midnight that the properties would go on, the new properties would go on to the choice-based letting system. And there'd be people who wait for that, and then they'd bid and they'd start, you know, near the top. And then they spend the rest of the week falling down the list. And in the end, the vast majority of lettings were done through managed lettings, moving people out of TA, moving people out of supported. And the whole thing is a farcical fantasy. And, you know, if there's a problem with lettings, it isn't about our housing associations cherry picking or our councils trying to push more difficult tenants onto housing associations, which is, you know, sometimes you get the claim on the other side. It's the fact that there isn't enough social housing, and we're investing, well, certainly local authorities are investing quite a lot of money and time and effort putting people in a queue that they'll never get to the front of. And it's soul destroying for so many people.
So we
That's
have
what
got,
we need to be talking about, not
yeah,
about
and I was,
is anybody cherry picking.
yeah, and I think just looking at Sheila, thinking actually, it would be a nice bit of work maybe for Labour Housing Group to look at in terms of allocations, and I don't think we've had a root and branch
I mean, just
looking
quickly
at
to
allocations for a long
Alison
time.
Leach, the local authority tells you who to house, so it's monitored directly through the, you know, that agreement.
Right, I just wanted, and Sheila's got her literal hand up because she's the host and can't put a pretend hand up, which always gets confusing. Before I go to you, Sheila, there's a question on the chat from Nick about the private rental sector. Um, so I'll read that out. More recent history has been the rise and fall of the PRS, which of
Yeah.
course houses many social housing tenants.
Hmm.
Incentivized at a time of cheap capital, the PRS grew to house over 20% and is now falling apart. What are your views, given the impact that this demise is having on local authorities?
Well, I agree with the main point that Nick's making. I think that there's a problem in that there's been, you know, rightly a lot of focus on the quality of housing in the social housing sector, you know, and you know, I applaud the work that Quajo and ITV and stuff has done, because it needs to be said. We need, you know, sometimes we have to take the rose tinted glasses off, and there are people in local authority, there are some people in local authority and housing association properties living in absolutely terrible conditions. But what that's done is taken the focus off how terrible the bottom end of the private rented sector is. And a lot of it is absolutely miserable, incredibly highly priced, and, you know, almost completely unregulated. There's a rule that that local authorities, without Secretary of State approval, maybe that might be something that will change if the government changes, can only regulate 20% of the private rented sector at any one time. Why? What I can't see absolutely any logic for that at all. The private rented sector should be regulated. It should be subject to the Housing Ombudsman service in exactly the way that housing associations and local authorities are. That might, as it said, it might drive some people out of the private rented sector. Well, fine. The houses don't disappear. Maybe they go back into owner occupation. Maybe they get bought back. You know, if they're ex-council houses, you know, 42% of houses bought under the right to buy are now private rented. Be great to see a lot of those go back to either the council landlord or the housing association landlord in that area if there isn't a council, and bring them back into the social sector. You know, I'm sure we've all got examples of where you've got a private let on an estate next door to a council property. The rent's 3 times as much. There's no repair service. The property's absolutely falling apart, and nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. So there's a huge issue about this massive unregulated sector. That doesn't mean that there aren't issues about the regulated sector, because there are. And, you know, we can see those on social media every day, but it is giving cover to the private rented sector.
Sheila, did you have a question?
Yes. And I appreciate that things have changed quite a bit since I retired in 2016, retired from paid work. But I spent a very large proportion of the years from 1995 to 2016 writing homelessness strategies and then helping local authorities to work out what had happened to as a result of their last homelessness strategy, what the needs were. And as some of that work involved me looking at who had been housed. And I know that a lot of local authorities where housing associations had taken all the council stock, had been stock transfer, absolutely could not get people out of temporary accommodation because the housing associations did not accommodate the people who were at the top of the list from the temporary accommodation. I've got a picture in my mind of a block of flats that were temporary accommodation somewhere in the northwest, and the residents in there told me how long they had been waiting to get housed, and they'd been told by the housing association that they just would not get moved. And that housing association took absolutely no notice of the nominations that were coming from the local authority. Now, I know that improved, but in my own authority that I was involved with for many years in Newcastle, the housing associations would not comply with, they wouldn't work and join in with the local authority to monitor who was being housed from the homelessness list into their stock. They just would not do it. I believe that most of the housing associations still do not work with the local authority. And in this region, the northeast, we're not only housing people who are homeless, although it's got a lot of worse in the last few years. So I think the accountability of housing associations to house the people in the greatest need just has not been good enough in the last 30 years since the big stock transfer in particular, stock transfers. It's been a real issue for people working in that sector, in the homelessness sector. I spent many years trying to help local authorities to work out how to house single homeless people, and again, not getting the housing association, so not the priority homeless, but not getting the housing associations to play ball. So I don't think it was a myth, and I suspect it still isn't, that housing associations are trying to choose the best. And now we have housing associations who charge deposits and rent in advance, which didn't happen when I was still working. I think that's absolutely shocking. I tried to get into the manifesto a line saying, a couple of years ago, a line saying that that would be ruled out. Housing associations could not charge rent in advance or a deposit. Because that rules out letting to people who are in dire poverty. There are other examples, but I really think that it is not a myth. So I haven't got a question. I just wanted to tell you what I thought. I wanted also, though, to pick up a big issue that was very prevalent when I was a councillor, which was that housing associations didn't see themselves as accountable to councillors and therefore to the local authority when tenants were trying to tackle repairs issues. And I wanted to ask you if you think that has changed at all.
I think it. I mean, there's a danger, isn't there, about talking about local authorities and housing associations, because there's huge differences between them. And there are some good and some bad, and some that are good in some places and not good in others. Funnily enough, one of the first letters I wrote after I got elected in 2016 was to the housing association I'm now chief executive of, about how disgusting one of their properties was, and to get them to fix it, and saying, you want me to promote housing associations as a solution, well, you need to show that you are. And I think local authorities need to make sure that they are using their powers, but there has to be a recognition that local authorities have been absolutely hollowed out. I mean, what's happened to local authorities since 2010 is absolutely incredible in terms of the austerity by stealth at scale that's happened in that sector, because it's so easy for central government to blame local authorities for it. I saw Simon Price's comment whilst you were talking as well about affordability checks, and certainly as a board member of a housing association, something I raise with my housing association is that affordability checks should not be used as a way of pricing people out of social housing. It should be a way of making sure that you can find a way that it will work out for them, and that people will be able to pay. But, you know, having said, as I said earlier, the benefit cap is actually making it impossible for a large number of people to afford any type of housing whatsoever, except for housing that's paid for by somebody else, i.e. temporary accommodation, where they don't pay the rent, the local authority pays the rent,
Right.
which you're seeing a lot of local authorities almost going under just because of their temporary accommodation cost. If I look at my association and some of the other associations in Bristol, you know, we are the supported housing providers. We take people that would not very often go into local authority housing because the support services aren't there from local authorities. So, you know, we provide housing for homeless single people and homeless families that otherwise probably would be in TA, but TA without support. And so you have to remember that there are housing associations that specialise in housing those most distant from the market. And I mean, I share other people's view that the word vulnerable is much overused and often not appropriate. But we house those that have experienced and have been failed the most, not just by the housing system, but by lots of systems. And when I look at our general, because we do general needs as well as supported and specialist housing, if I look at our general needs housing, nearly all of the lettings I'm doing are going to people coming out of temporary accommodation. And maybe you know, interesting, my local authority was prioritising the new housing that was being built. They were prioritising moving people out of tower blocks into the new housing, and then moving people from TA into the tower blocks, so that you almost have got this sort of escalator approach. And when they're moving people often on transfers from, say, high-rise council accommodation to new build houses, there are people who haven't got any arrears. So local authorities can cherry pick as well, not just housing associations. And I've seen approaches, particularly to new build council housing, where tenants are cherry picked. I've also seen in the past, I've also seen the opposite, where councils have said, well, in the new accommodation we build, we'll only put people on benefits because they're much less likely to exercise the right to buy. So there are all sorts of perverse incentives, both on housing associations, local authorities, to do the wrong thing, and which comes back to issues of lack of there isn't enough social housing. Not by the 90,000, but by millions. There isn't enough social housing in this country, and also we've got a benefit system which is dreadfully penalising people. And it does worry me that we don't see enough discussion of the impact of the benefit system on the housing solutions that are available to people, particularly the benefit cap, but also the 2-child limit and some of the other things, the bedroom tax. There's a whole range of things in the benefit system which seem to me to be about punishing people on low incomes or no income rather than supporting them. And the housing sector, whether it's local authorities or housing associations, are on the receiving end of that.
And one of the things that I think housing associations can do, and I'm thinking whether actually this question, friend or foe, is actually, situation is far more complicated, and there are different alliances
Yeah.
different groupings, different things that people have got in common across the sector. And I think a lot of people would argue that accountability is, I'm looking at Ian, just down the road from me, runs a lovely little housing association in South Essex that is, geographically based, part of the community, absolutely accountable to the people of Southend and beyond. But then I'm looking at Nigel, who's on the call, part of used to work for Places for People, who managed to be enormous and yet local. And that's, that was an interesting model, I think, compared to some of the larger organisations that just do feel a bit like North Korea. But I'm on the board of a stock transfer association in South Norfolk, and I think we went on a typical journey post-transfer. It was a bit like teenage kids going, yeah, I'm going out with mum and dad, absolutely, without any respect for the municipal history, I think, of the organisation, where its roots were, who actually paid for the homes to be built, over previous 80 years or whatever. But actually, it feels like the relationship is much more grown up now. COVID really helped, which sounds a bit daft, but it brought us back together. It was people of South Norfolk. It didn't matter. We gave our DLO who couldn't do repairs. They went to the council to work and did all sorts of stuff. And since then we've felt closer to them than I think they had done in the previous sort of 20 years. And maybe the division that we're seeing and we need to, think about is between, the very large national organisations, and
I
more
think there's a
community.
big issue about how you respond to locality, and that issue about accountability to the local community. And the only organisation that's got the legitimacy to hold the ring on that is the local authority. The local authority is the only organisation which is set up to represent the local community, and therefore, it's incumbent on, I think, on housing associations to work locally with each local authority. And that's, I think that's critically important, because I don't think anybody else can join it up at a local level, and housing associations need to respect the democratic legitimacy of local councils.
So I'm going to ask Sheila's now telling me to ask more questions, so I'm going to do that. So I'm getting excited. But before I do that, just feeding off what you've said, Paul, and it would be wonderful to see place-based tenant scrutiny really take hold. So actually for, tenants of different organisations within a local authority area, scrutinising services from
I'd
all
like
their
to see more tenant organisations which are independent of landlords. I think TPAS has got a question to answer a bit, because they've also, tenant involvement, and we did this as I say, in Bristol in the 80s. My mum was the chair of the area housing committee. Is that we created tenant involvement. We do this in housing associations as well, as part of our bureaucracy, and therefore, for people to be involved, they have to become bureaucrats in some way or another. And I think one of the most exciting developments in the last few years is the development of tenant unions. Now, in Bristol, Acorn was set up initially to deal with issues in the private rented sector. They've now spread from Bristol to lots of other cities, but it's self-mobilising tenants, not tenants being organised by their landlord. I think is a bit weird. You wouldn't have had, the 1917, rent strike in Glasgow if it was organised by the landlords. It had to be organised by the tenants, and I think, as well as seeing, somebody mentioned about community-led housing, which I'm a big fan of community-led housing. I also think tenants organising themselves is a really good thing as well. They can then interact with whatever bureaucratic structures we've got, what other systems of engagement we've got. But setting up your own tenant groups, which you sort of control through, you know, bureaucratic means. It does bring benefits, it is useful, but I think it is limited as well.
I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because it'll be, well, get into trouble. So we've got several questions on here. Does anyone want to actually ask a question, or are you happy for me to just read them? I'm suddenly being democratic about this. I noticed there was one from Dinesh, I think, around the rise of for-profits.
Mhm.
I don't
I-
think tenants care as long as it's got somewhere to live.
I do sort of worry about it a bit. I mean, what you've seen in some other countries is big investors coming in, starting off as social housing, then using their financial and political muscle to deregulate sectors, and then to basically move social housing tenants out. And we might say, well, that wouldn't you know, that those sorts of things might happen in the US, but they won't happen here. But I fear a further residualization. Now they all get V1 G1 and they're great, you know, but the reason they do that is because all their stock is new. Most of it is shared ownership. So, you know, they're milking the cow to a certain extent. But, you know, maybe I'm a bit old fashioned, but it it worries me about where that's taking us. And, you know, going back to that earlier argument, which I know some people got really bored with, but the idea that you move from council to housing association, then you move from housing association to for profits, and before you know it, it's all for profit. And it's you know, pretty much everything apart from maybe a small residualized state sector is in the private sector, as you find in quite a lot of the USA. So I may be paranoid, I may be an old-fashioned lefty, but it worries me.
Okie doke. Interesting. Simon, would you advocate a new stock transfer program?
Would Simon advocate one, or would I advocate one?
Would you?
I mean, to do it with the existing stock would be massively expensive. I mean, if you look at how it works, the government would have to write off huge amounts of local authority debt. You know, would it be better they just put that money into the social housing sector rather than? I mean, stock transfer did bring a lot of investment into housing. You could argue that in some instances it saved some local authority housing departments. But is that the best place to put an awful lot of borrowing? And also you have to remember, and I made money out of it as a consultant, as Simon knows, because I worked with him at Oxford, is that it was huge money for finance organizations, lawyers, consultants, and all the rest of it. It sucked out of the provision of housing into that stock transfer. I'd rather that social housing, whoever it's owned by, is properly funded.
A really interesting question from Alison, going back to what we were talking about earlier. Do housing associations do enough to assess their impact on homelessness? And I think we should do a shout out for Homes for Kathy,
Yeah.
which is a grouping of housing associations who are doing fantastic work within that homelessness space.
Yeah. And which is focused around the housing association working with the local authority. The answer to the question is some do and some don't. Sorry, I just want to go back to one thing on the stock transfers. The sort of stock transfer that, if we were going to have it, that I would like is transfers of estates to tenant control, or largely tenant controlled organisations.
I'm going to fire a couple of quick ones at you. So Maren is on the call, who is doing some fantastic work looking at possibility of a new, or making the case for a new national tenant voice. Yay or nay?
Yay.
Because
because I think there needs to be funding to make that possible. If I give a slightly longer answer, you shut me up if you need to, because I could talk for 58 hours on all this. Is when I was a student, I came from a council estate which had very few facilities. I went to university and saw that the students' union got huge amounts of money to organise all sorts of. Yeah, it was a long time ago, Claire. I feel like I'm being heckled by the chat. You organised all sorts of stuff and had access to huge amounts of resource, and I'd like to see, more of that on the stakes. Why shouldn't there be, in the same way effectively that students' unions are funded by the state, that why shouldn't tenants' organisations also be funded? Well, and there does need to be, if you're going to do that, there should be a national voice. Now, I would prefer it that there was funding into organisations at a local level, and they funded a national organisation which they controlled. But there has to be a national voice for tenants, and I think it was incredibly sad that sort of Taro fell away.
Shout out from Cavan for TMOs, and I think John and Andy would both join in.
And
both
TOOs.
And sorry?
And TOOs. Tenant ownership organisations. They don't have to be management. There's no reason why tenants can't own the accommodation. I mean, co-ops are much more common in other countries than they are here.
I think we're starting to run out of time, so I'm going to ask you. We're expecting the manifesto to drop before too long. What would you like to see in it for housing?
Well, I don't.
What would you like to see in it?
What I would like to see, well, number one, right to buy. To my mind, it's, I mean, as Andy Burnham said, you're taking the plug out whilst you're trying to pour water in, and in fact, the plug hole is much bigger than the tap, and it has been for a long time. Now, we could go back to the right to buy that we had before the 1980 Act, which is tenants could apply to buy their home at full market value, and then the council could decide whether or not to let them buy it. But the right to buy, and I think this is what Andy Burnham was talking about, but I don't think it, the extent to which it was understood is there's a massive disincentive to local authorities to build new housing just to see it fly out at a discount at the other end at a short period of time. They might as well just go and sit in the road and set fire to money. And so, even with the cost floor, it doesn't really help. We've seen, the Sterling Prize scheme in Norwich is already starting to be sold. So right for me, right to buy. What you could do is keep it but add the discount at zero, with some choice for the local authority about whether or not it accepts it, which is where we were before 1980. Then obviously the obvious one about building more social housing. Then we also need, as I've said a few times, we need to have a benefit system that works. That isn't, the purpose of the benefit system to me seems to be to penalise people rather than to support people. So if we don't deal with the supply, the loss of housing, and also the affordability of housing, then we're not really going to make any real progress. And then that regulation piece of the private rented sector.
My techie one would be around rent. I think the rent regime
it's all complete
housing
chaos.
Associations, local authorities, affordable, intermediate, social. I mean, it's so common nowadays for two people to be living next door to each other and one paying 30, 40, 50 quid a week more than the person.
One thing that a lot of people don't realise is that social rent, a target social rent, is the same whether a housing association tenant or a local authority tenant. It's done on the same formula. It's just that the formula's mad. I mean, who cares what the property was worth in January 1999 when it was built in 2018? So we do need to find a fair system. We do need to bring the affordable rents and the social rents back together. So we do need a system of rent, you know, the old classic rent convergence. I wouldn't say it's going to be easy, but you know, we need to find a way of dealing with it. I mean, the other thing I would bring in, which is sort of a bit tangential, is I'd like to see a land value tax instead of a council tax. Because what we don't do in this country is tax wealth. We only tax transactions on the whole. You know,
Stop you there. Can I stop you there and say,
yeah, of course you can.
20 to 8 is not the time to start talking about land value tax, because
When is
don't
the
do
time,
it.
Alison? I mean, if we were down the pub now, 20 to 8 would be the perfect time to start talking about a land value tax.
Land value tax is what you talk about in the pub. What do you think?
But we have to tax wealth. If we don't tax wealth, we can't do anything.
So my final question is, what will be in the manifesto, do you think?
Some really nice pictures.
Okay. John, so you're not, I was going to say, John, I've forgotten your name already. Paul. I mean, thank you. We've already had an extra 10 minutes out of you. I could talk to you for forever. What do you think what conclusions can we draw from what you've said? That friend or foe, to go back to your initial question?
They need to be a friend. They need to be a friend of local authorities, and housing associations need to be friends. Housing associations can deliver and can help local authorities. Local authorities need to be respected for their legitimacy to set strategy for their local areas.
Brilliant. And Labour Housing Group needs maybe to do some work on nominations at some point. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. I just remind you again that we've got John Perry, I think, talking to Andy on the 6th of June. A massive thank you to Paul, who's wearing a lovely shirt with pictures of houses in Rotterdam on the wall, especially.
When you call Paul Smith, you've got to think about your shirt.
Yeah, show everyone your shirt, though. It's absolutely lovely. There you go, Mr. Housing. Thank you all. And if we don't see you on the 6th of June, we'll see you when we have a new Labour government, and we're all talking about how we can influence housing policy and begin to make a real difference. So thank you, everybody. Now go and deliver some leaflets or knock on some doors.
Thank you, Alison. Lovely to talk to you.
And you.
Cheers,
Thank
Paul.
you, Paul.
Cheers, Alison.
Bye.
Brilliant evening. Bye now.
Lots of love, Jim.